All right, this is going to be a part two. So when being, you know, privy to wisdom, you come to know history. Now, in ancient times, you have this guy Antiochus Epiphanes, which gives you, the reality of pride, and what it will eventually lead to. Now, I want to get this historical account here with me. Hopefully, I can get it. So, in Second Maccabees, the downfall of King Antiochus Epiphanes sharply contrasts his supreme arrogance with a grotesque, divinely inflicted physical plague that forces his total humiliation. And Antiochus, he was an Edomite. He is, give you historical account. He was a king of the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC. He persecuted the Jews of Judea, Samaria, and was, fighting the rebellion of the Jewish, Maccabees, right? So again, this is, a story of pride and and the result of pride. So this historical account will give you some idea of the shame that the Lord will ultimately bring upon the glory of this American kingdom. So Antiochus, imagine he possessed superhuman power, believing he could command the waves of the sea and weigh the mountaintops on the scale. Now, this is a figure of speech, signifying his pride. I don't think he actually believed, he could command the waves of the sea. Who knows, right? But and when you read the book of Maccabees, it was a figure of speech signifying his great pride. He had a godlike mentality. I don't know how much he thought himself to be a god, actually. In fact, the word epiphanies, um, it means um manifest. It was commonly used as an epithet for Hellenistic kings to emphasize their divine or exalted status, reflecting the practice of self-deification among the rulers of their era. So its epithet means God manifest, you know? So these Edomites, you know, as it was back then, even so today, during the Greek, Roman empires, even so today, they have a God-like mentality, a God complex. They think themselves to be gods. They deify themselves. When you go into those different monuments in Washington, how they portray themselves upon the ceilings of their monuments as sitting upon clouds, dressed in robes, and in glory. They deify themselves. This guy Trump, he even gave himself the epitaph. When you watch, some of his, statements throughout the years, he gave himself the epitaph of being the chosen one. You know, he's making even monuments today in his name, in his own name. You know, building a ballroom, to signify his glory. No, um, so his epitaph highlights his claim to divine authority. In fact, I'm reading this now. Historically, some mockingly called him Epiph, Epip, Epimenes. I think that's how you pronounce it. So you had, and I'm reading it now. Let's read it. I'm busy. I gotta get this work done. Sorry, mother. Um, a person or thing living or existing at the same time as another. So people around his time would call him Epimenes, meaning the mad one, due to his erratic and tyrannical behavior. Bear with me. All right, so lock it. I'm back. But anyways, so during his time, he gave himself, the epitaph, which means God manifests, epiphanies. Some called him Epimanes, which means the mad one, and we can see a parallel between him and Trump. And this is why coming into this truth, you also come to the knowledge of history. You know, you know, uh, and you come to gain, you know, a right perspective of history, because anybody could look back upon the times before, but without spiritual understanding, and perspective, and the thing is, this when you go into the book of Second Esdras, I think First Esdras, there was a matter of discussion concerning things that be strong in his will, and one that was brought up was truth, and truth was described as being a strength and a kingdom and the power of all ages, and yeah, truth, what is the standard of truth? The word of the Most High, you know, uh, his judgment, so when it comes to these Edomites, man, as it was back then, and so it is today, they will, receive their due reward, their due recompense, because judgment always stands. It's not slack. Neither is it early. We can also, acknowledge as well. And the time shall come where their their patterns of evil, of chaos, of pride will be uh, rewarded. Will be you know uh, reversed onto them. And, this place will fall via violence. Because this place have committed much violence. Most importantly, to the children of Israel, which is you so-called Negroes, Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Indians throughout history, you know? So going back to this historical account that I want to get, you know, Antiochus, he was proud, you know, his pride was framed, it was so great, you know, he had a godlike mentality. And I don't believe that he had, you know, really think he had superpowers. Who knows? Maybe he did. But when you read the scriptures, you know, in the book of Maccabees, it says, you know, he thought to have commanded the seas, you know, and weighed the mountaintops on a scale, basically signifying his pride ultimately, not literal, you know. So, you know, he vowed to make Jerusalem a graveyard for the Jewish people. You know, he thought he could reach the very stars of heaven and act as an equal to God. Um, and I'm on Google, you know, basically summing up, you know, these are different accounts in the book, in the Bible, you know, in the book of Maccabees. So, you know, basically he had pride, you know, he had, you know, great ambitions. And the thing is, ambitions can be to the point of pride. Ain't nothing wrong with having ambitions as a man, you know, but there's a boundary, you know. So his pride ultimately led to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai striking him with an invisible and incurable blow to his bowels, causing severe and merciless eternal agony. So the Lord plagued him, you know, gave him a disease in his stomach, you know, in his bowels and his organs, you know, causing severe internal agony. It says, refusing to calm his rage, he ordered his driver to speed faster, resulting in a violent fall from his chariot that battered and bruised every limb of his body. Yeah, and the chariots, it symbolized one's authority and power onto might, you know, which the Lord literally did that to him. But you think about the march or the stride of Esau today. His march, his pattern, the way that he's going today, you know, in respect of the Middle East, Iran, you know, even to his own uh, alliance, to those who would be at peace with him, NATO. You know, you know, those of you who keep up with, you know, his actions with Greenland, you know, which is you know, under, I think, what was it, under Denmark? I may be mistaken, forgive me, you know, but under a NATO member. So he's putting his hand against those that be at peace with him. You know, he's causing trouble. He's being terrible and, you know, just being an agent of chaos in the Middle East, along with Little America, you know. So it says, the king who fancied himself master of the earth had to be hoisted onto a litter and carried by others. So this shows you the contrast between his pride and his downfall. The Lord humbled him, the Lord humiliated him. It says worms swarmed from his rotting flesh while he was still alive. and his body produced an unbearable, sickening stench that repelled his entire army. And yeah, you think about what the Lord is going to do to America as a whole by the pride, because of the pride of the elites, of the rulers of this place. And, as the rulers saw the people, so even the pride of the people, you know, the common general, people, in the military, you know, the Lord is going to sustain the glory of this place. And, when we read Second Ezra chapter 15, it tell you that the dragons of Arabia and the Carmenians, which I was join forces together, the time shall come where they're going to have the upper hand. So those Iranians, which are the Carmenians, and certain Arab nations will begin to have the upper hand. And they're going to ultimately put to shame America, American forces in those regions, in the war. The time shall come where a lot of you American sons and daughters who are part of the military, they're going to be put to shame. World War III is going to be just a humiliation period, before the final end of this place ultimately. So the time shall come militarily, this place is going to be put to shame. This place is going to, its honor, its glory, its image is going to be stained. Even now it is stained, because this is being considered now between America and Iran, but it is being considered to be a conflict that America is losing or have lost already. You know, so the pride and terribleness of this place of Edom is deceiving him, and is ultimately going to lead to its demise. And I'm going to get this scripture real quick. End it all with this. Isaiah chapter 33, verse 11. It says, "You shall conceive chaff, you shall bring forth stubble. Your breath as fire shall devour you." And historically, this is going to, historians will consider this to only apply to, Assyria, the Assyrians, but the scriptures tell you, well, it ain't going to tell you straight up, but by the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, we have understanding of the mysteries of the secrets of Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. So America is modern day Babylon. And these Americans and these Edomites, they're modern day Assyrian. So America's that great war. So historians will relate this to, specifically to, ancient Babylon. But we know that this applies to America. Isaiah chapter 33, verse. And where's that scripture at? I just lost. Bear with me. Okay, verse 11. After we start at verse 10. Now will I rise, saith Yahweh. Now will I be exalted. Now will I lift up myself. Because we're coming into a time where Yahweh Bashim Yahushai will display his glory, will show his wrath, via these evils that shall be brought upon earth. That is what nuclear destruction is going to be, the climactic point of World War III. In the wrath and the coming of the Lord Yahweh Shai himself. It says, "You shall conceive chaff, you shall bring forth stubble, your breath as fire shall devour you." And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing, you think about chaff and stubble. In fact, let's get this real quick. Chaff and stubble, is worthless grain and dry plant matter that was used to be burnt in ancient times. Now, Esau, he's putting forth all the things, basically, you shall conceive chaff and bring forth stubble. In other words, action, by your actions, by your patterns, by your plans, by your devices, by your behavior. You're putting things together, right? Right, material that can be burnt. It says, "You shall conceive chaff and bring forth stubble, your breath as a fire." Your breath, your actions, your behavior, your plans, your will, your spirit is as a fire that will consume you. In other words, your actions will result in your own destruction. To put it simply, you know, you bring in all the recipe for disaster, basically. You know, you bring all the recipes, all the ingredients, you know, for disaster. You know, all the things you need for your own demise, you bringing it yourself. Yeah, and you think about chaff and stubble, you know, uh, is worthless material that was used to be burnt up. And you think about everything that Esau's doing is vain. It's only going to end in destruction ultimately. It's like chaff and stubble only end in fire. That's what it was used for. So all his pride, all his actions, all his plans will end in destruction. And that's what fire symbolized: destruction, judgment, wrath. So you're bringing all of the material for your own demise. You know, bear with me. Let me see something real quick. So his pride, his actions, his behavior, his plans, is going to lead to his own destruction. So let's read that scripture again. You shall conceive chaff, you shall bring forth stubble, your breath as fire shall devour you. It says, and the people shall be as the burning lime. And that's what's coming, destruction. And specifically the utmost destruction, nuclear destruction. But even before that, World War III, those soldiers, the military of America, you're going to be consumed. You're going to be put to shame. You're going to be at a loss in that war. Especially when ground invasions and, when actual troops is moved forward and the draft will come, which in December, Esau have already prepared a draft. Esau have already, you know, set up, simulations on how to do a draft. So Esau he's preparing to send your sons and daughters, your young men to war. So when the people there shall be as a burning lime, as thorns cut up, shall they be burnt in the fire. And ultimately the utmost destruction will be nuclear destruction. It says, hear ye that are far off what I have done, and ye that are near acknowledge my might. And the time shall come where nations at the knowledge of America or some will rejoice and sorrow, and some will sorrow, some will mourn. And the scriptures point to that in Ezekiel 35, I think, or chapter 34. Speaks about, the whole earth shall rejoice, at the desolation of this place of Edom, you know, which America's the top central part of Esau's power. All the scriptures, Revelation points to some mourning at the destruction of this place, you know. But that's really all I wanted to touch on. Lord willing, His lessons at the shrine. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Shalom.